and welcome back to Book and Page. We're on to the fourth video of the Bacchae, which is technically scene 3. This is getting very confusing. Okay, so as always, we'll do a summary of what happened in the scene, and then we'll get to some talking points. So, Dionysus, the voice of the god, comes off from off stage, and shakes down Pentheus' house, and terrifies his own initiates. Then Dionysus, as a disguised human initiate, comes on stage, tells the chorus to buck up, shouldn't be frightened, this is literally your god, and then recounts his escape from Pentheus' jail, thanks to Pentheus trying to tie up a cow instead of him, and of course some assistance from Dionysus. Pentheus arrives and attempts to recapture the disguised Dionysus, but is in fact interrupted by a messenger. Hey, this is that thing that happens where all the extreme action and violence happens offstage, and we just have someone come in and tell us. So the messenger does tell us many things. It turns out the women are just enjoying their party. They got some animal companions going on. They're just making milk and honey flow from the earth. You know, the normal things. And then the men try and capture them. And the women turn extremely violent and even tear some cows apart with their hands. Whoops. So we haven't captured anybody, but I survived and I got back here and I'm telling you about it. So Dionysus does offer, he says, I will bring the women into the city without weapons, without violence. And Pentheus says, nope, I want to go and see this myself. So, with that decision made, Dionysus is like, yeah, I could take you up there, but you should go dressed as a woman so that they won't, you know, kill you. And so Pentheus goes back inside his ruined house to think about it. Which makes Dionysus real happy, because soon he's gonna have revenge. Are you allowed to do evil laughter when it's a god? It seemed like the appropriate time. And the scene fully ends with an odd chorus about being wise and happy. Okay, so, crazy information. And again, not anything we're seeing. Don't be surprised though if you see some modern performances of this play that are going to show this on stage. Either prior to the messenger coming in, maybe it's sort of a tableau thing where the messenger's talking, you're seeing it played out, but just keep that in mind that that would not be happening in the regular Greek performance. All of that action is off stage, only things on stage are talking. And this is going to become even more apparent as we finish up the play, but this is the really first big example of it, is this report of the women doing very unnatural things, and then just turning super violent. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the chapter. Okay, so the first thing we have to talk about is this odd switch in the script itself, in the text. And that is that partway through this play, we suddenly have a switch from the regular verse to a section in what appears to be prose. And we do have some breaks, so at first you think, oh, maybe it's verse but very long lines, but those breaks disappear, and by comparison the messenger has very long lines in his verse, but you can still see very clearly breaks in the text, so it is still verse. But we've got this section here that's actually in prose, and that is a switch up that we always have to take notice of when we have a change in the text itself, in how everything's presented. So, what's actually happening here? Truth be told, I don't know. There's some hints that we can look at. We are still seeing some breaks here, so maybe something just happened with the printing of the translation and it is supposed to be verse. Maybe it is just this one translator, and other translations don't have this prose section. But if they do, we have to try and figure out why we possibly have some prose here. Now, Shakespeare is famous for using this verse and prose change-up, and he generally used it to differentiate when a low-born person was talking in the play versus a high-born person. If you read a lot of Shakespearean plays, you'll notice that low-borns tend to speak in prose, while high-borns speak in verse. And this isn't always the case, but it's certainly what shows up in Shakespeare. For us, we can say, well, that's not true here, because the prose section is Dionysus speaking. So, we definitely can't say it's a low-born person talking, because it's Dionysus. So, let's try and parcel out what's actually happening here. Is it because he's reflecting on an event that occurred off stage? Again, no, because the messenger does the same thing, and the messenger, of course, still speaks in verse. Is it because Dionysus is being deceitful? Because he's talking about assistance as a human being. He's acting like he's a human right now, and got assistance from the god, when in truth they're the same people. Dionysus is very deceitful in this play that we found, and will continue to find. He deceives Pentheus quite a bit, and continues to do it in verse. So it doesn't seem to be the idea of deceit causing the switch. It doesn't seem to be reflection. It's definitely not a change in who's speaking, because this is Dionysus. So, truth be told, I don't have an easy answer for this. Maybe there isn't an easy answer. Like I said, if it's purely this translation, then that could be just a printing error. And I'm sort of curious if anyone else has a different translation of Bacchae, if you are seeing that section in prose. But it is something we have to consider. If it is there, and it is there across all translations, then there's a reason that switch occurred. And it's something that we have to keep in mind and try and think about why we are seeing this switch to prose. Same thing if you go on and read other texts and you're switching between prose and verse, try and figure out why you're seeing that switch. Okay, so with the discussion of the script out of the way, let's talk about what actually happened in the scene. Well, what, like I said, didn't actually happen in the scene, but what we hear about in the scene, which is this unnatural happenings and sudden incredible violence. Which we certainly got a hint was a possibility. Dionysus has been warning Pentheus and the audience about this from the very beginning, about how the dance can turn violent. But it's suddenly happened now, and it didn't happen against a person, Pentheus, that we assumed it was going to happen against. It happened against some cows, and possibly some people, which were the men who attacked them. But the messenger survives, so he comes back, and he tells us that before the violence, there's some Bacchic rituals happening that we need to also try and address. So we do get a clear report of some of the strange happenings with this milk and honey situation, and some of the women taking on animal companions in place of their own children. That's what the messenger tells us, is the women who have animals seem to be suckling the animals, which means that they had babies that they left behind in the Bacchic madness, and they're now up in the mountains taking care of some baby animals. And what's really interesting about this is it is definitely this weird combination between things that aren't supposed to happen this way, yet also Tiresias said before that if a woman wouldn't normally do this, she wouldn't do it. He was referring, of course, to sex. If it's a woman who's not interested in free-for-all sex, she's not going to be having free-for-all sex. But it seems to be true of other things as well. The women who are suckling small animals are the ones who would normally be suckling babies. So we've got this weird thing where it feels super unnatural, but there is sort of a connection to what's actually happening. like milk and honey come from natural sources anyways, not the natural sources we're seeing here, which is rocks and ground, but they are things that we get from nature, cows and other animals, and of course bees. So things are doing normal things, but in the wrong way, right? Mothers are suckling babies, just the wrong type of babies. So it really is this weird disconnect, and new connections, as it were, that allow these strange formations to actually happen. No woman who wouldn't be suckling a baby seems to be suckling a small animal. So it's this really weird thing, because we have to keep in mind that there is some sort of method in all this madness. That these different connections are allowed by the gods, but we can see traces of them in the natural world. We're not yet having anybody hit somebody in the head and have honey come flowing out. But rocks seem to be able to do that right now. We don't have any non-nursing mothers trying to nurse babies. We aren't seeing any women who wouldn't have sex having sex, right? So the madness has some limits. It makes different connections for people, but the start of those connections already have to be there. Which then leads into that incredible violence, which has got to be a terrifying prospect for all of us, right? Because what we're seeing are the Theban princesses, or I suppose queen mothers and queen aunts. Because they wouldn't be princesses now because their father's not king. We are seeing the women of the royal family, and what we can assume are probably housewives for the most part, and homemakers, who have gone running off into the woods and then turned violent. So if those hints of those unnatural things have to be already present, that should say something about what these women are in fact capable of. And that is, it's not just like a slap fight. We get reports of these women tearing cows to pieces with their hands. We are going to see it happen with people. So that type of violence is already present within these women, or at least the possibility of that violence is present in these women. Though it should be noted that it has to be actively driven out of them. The women haven't turned violent for no reason. They turned violent when they were attacked. It is the men actively acting against them that prompts them to get up and become violent. The men say they're actually very docile at the beginning, because they're drinking milk and honey and wine and playing with the animals and running through the woods. It isn't until they're attacked that this violence becomes a possibility. But Dionysus is warned this has been a possibility from the beginning. For a god of wine and partying and things like that, he also seems to be a god who deeply understands human nature and the extreme possibility of violence if they're pushed to their limits. And he allows that to come to the surface. And this is really important when it comes to Greek women. Ancient Greece was not a super good place to be a woman. It was better if you were in Sparta. You weren't part of the community, technically, as a woman. You take care of the homes. But in that famous birth of democracy, it is the men of the community, the landowning men of the community, who are making those votes. It's not the women. So the fact that Dionysus is bringing out the very core of these people out of the women is sort of really interesting. But the play also subverts that very message, because we constantly get this idea that you can't be a woman and be masculine, or you can't be a man and be feminine. Several times, Pentheus, again, we see insulting the disguised Dionysus for appearing womanly and feminine. And, well, obviously he's not a wrestler, because that's a man's thing, and you can't look that pretty and be a wrestler. And in fact, he himself says it would be absolutely disgusting for him to dress up as a woman, even as a disguise. The play is saying that there is a difference between them, but there's also this reference that at this very core, that violence is, well, that becomes the question. Is that violence purely at the core of women, or is it at the core of humanity? Did we get the women going mad and then becoming violent specifically because that is a gendered thing? It is something we have to keep in mind and something we certainly have to interrogate. And sort of to finish this off, we do have this really weird switch in Pentheus's attitude after this messenger shows up. Prior to the messenger, he comes in ready to throw the disguised Dionysus back into jail, right? And then the messenger shows up, and suddenly Pentheus is incredibly interested in seeing what these women are capable of. And the weird thing is, it's not about seeing the women. It is specifically about seeing the violence. Because Dionysus does actually offer to bring the women into Thebes again without weapons and without violence. And Pentheus outright rejects that. Prior to this point, we thought he was trying to get the women to come back and end the rituals. But suddenly at this possibility of being able to witness this extreme violence, Pentheus no longer cares about that. All he cares about is going to view it himself. And in fact, he's willing to put himself in what he considers a disgusting situation by going dressed as a woman, because he is so attracted to the violence that he'll do violence to what he considers his own person. And that's really weird. And deeply uncomfortable, because he is the king of Thebes. What does that say if he's so attracted to violence that he stops caring about the safety of his people, the safety of his city, and even his own safety? Literally, he is so interested in viewing this violence that he becomes very easy to manipulate. And while Dionysus has been in control of most of these conversations, Pentheus at least has been semi-in control of himself. And that disappears completely after this point. He is fully a puppet of Dionysus after this point, because violence to him is just so attractive that he needs to go and see it. Which is why I lean towards the idea that violence at its core is something being viewed as a human tendency, not just a womanly tendency, because we do see this change in Pentheus in wanting to view that violence. So, not a super comfortable chapter for all the weird and violent things happening. It's not going to get better. We're going to kill somebody soon. So, I'm going to keep reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.